everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today I'm live with Professor Bruce Chilton. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Excellent. Bruce received his Bachelor of Arts at Bard College, and then his Master's of Divinity at the General Theological Seminary, followed by an ordination to be diaconate and the priesthood. He then received a Ph.D. at Cambridge University. His books include Abraham's Curse, Rabbi Jesus, an Intimate Biography, God and Strength, Rabbi Paul, an Intellectual Biography, Judaic Approaches to the Gospels, Mary Magdalene, a Biography, Revelation, Trading Places, Jesus' Prayer and Jesus' Eucharist, Forging a Common Future, Jesus' Baptism and Jesus' Healing, Visions of the Apocalypse in Christianity, the Basics. He is also the editor-in-chief for the Bulletin for Biblical Research and the founding editor of the Journal for the Study of the New Testament, studying the Historical Jesus series, E.J. Brill and Eerdmans. He also has fellowship and awards with Jacob Neusner, Choice Magazine Award, Best Academic Book, 1998, Evangelical Scholars Fellowship, Whitney Humanities Center, Yale University, Heinrich Hertz Stiftung, Theological Development Fund of the Episcopal Church, National Conference of Christians and Jews, which was followed by receiving a Doctor of Divinity from the General Theological Seminary in 2011. So welcome to the podcast, Doctor.
It's good to be here.
Excellent. All right, so here's some links to purchase the book that we're going to be covering today, The Herods, Murder, Politics, and the Art of Succession. So I got 4 links there, one to Amazon, there to Fortress Press, Goodreads, and Augsburg Fortress. I'll have also all these links in the description below, so you can just go down there and click it for the sake of easy access. So let's start off with Herod the Great. What do you make of Herod the Great? What are your thoughts on him, his reign? Was he always such a tyrant, like from day one of his reign, or did he kind of gradually become worse over time?
What I came to enjoy tracing was the way in which Herod the Great gradually lost his way from being a very talented military commander and a charismatic figure who had tendencies to excess in the way of many talented people. But these were always controlled by his father, Antipater, and also by his brother, Phasael. Had it not been for their premature deaths, Herod the Great, I think, would have come to maturity a much more balanced person. But in fact, his father, Antipater, was killed in a conspiracy plot by poisoning. And then the primary enemy of the Romans of the time, the Parthians, brutally killed Herod's brother, Phasael. So then Phasael and Antipater gone, Herod was entirely on his own. He pursued the major outlines of their policies by aligning himself very strictly indeed with the Romans. And in doing that, he showed a certain degree of adaptability. But at the same time, he faced existential crisis when the same Parthians who had killed his brother came in, occupied Jerusalem, and attempted to kill him. He made his way back in some desperation to Rome, where Rome crowned him king, but in a way, the kingship was theoretical because the Parthians were there on the ground. So he had to return and to fight back for all of his territory. That fighting back made him increasingly extreme. And he also attempted to shore up his credibility within Judaism by marrying into the family of the Maccabees. But then, tragically, he and his wife, Mariamne, wound up at cross purposes, to some extent because Mariamne herself was a partisan for the same Maccabees. He had a division inside his house. That, I think, was really Herod the Great's tragic flaw. Until the moment when he came to be convinced that he had to fight against his own house, he seemed to keep his passion for tyranny in check. But after that time, he became increasingly suspicious. He actually came to the point where he disguised himself as an ordinary citizen in order to spy out conversations going on in Jerusalem. And worst of all, put to death his own wife, Mariamne, his sons by Mariamne, and yet another son, his firstborn son. So by the end of his life, he is a truly ill and pathetic figure. On his deathbed, he actually orders that the local aristocracy in the place where he died should be brought in to a public place and executed when the news of his death was announced, so that he would know that there would be mourning going on for him. He was, I think, more a tormented character than he was a tyrant. There's no doubt about his tyrannical impulses at all, but I think that they're really grounded in what I would describe as his tragic flaw.
What made him become more aggressive? Like you mentioned that that he started becoming worse when those deaths you were talking about earlier occurred. Why did those deaths start the process of him becoming more of a kind of a madman later?
I think they started it off because those two people in particular, Antipater and Phasael, were the two who were most able to contain his spontaneous aggression. Spontaneous aggression was simply something he had to manage. I think he had to manage them because he was a warrior, because also he was a very physical character. Into his 60s, he continued to hunt from horseback, because for him, this was simply a natural thing to do. Pursuit was the character of his military tactics, and it's also what he did in order to amuse himself. So however he had matured, he would always have needed someone to contain him. And when he lost Antipater and Phasael, and lost them indeed to acts of cowardly aggression, this left a traumatic mark on Herod the Great. And then I would add to that the fact that he genuinely loved his wife, his Maccabean wife, Mariamne. So when he became convinced that she turned against him, he, I think, largely lost touch with reality. He began to see everyone not only as a potential enemy, but as an enemy until proven otherwise. Ironically, probably his most consistent friend was the Emperor Augustus, more than anyone in his own household.
How do you look at the Massacre of the Innocents story? Do you think it could be partly inspired from Herod the Great killing his sons? I know some think that it is, and the rest of it is a rewrite of the Old Testament story of Moses and Pharaoh killing the innocents.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good observation that you make, that clearly the way in which the story of the Massacre of the Innocents is depicted in the Gospel according to Matthew, the point of the story is its fulfillment of Scripture. And that corresponds to a pattern in Matthew's Gospel, which is that when actual information is scarce, this stream of presentation in the Gospel uses materials from the Hebrew Bible in order to frame what must have happened. And the story of the slaughter of the innocents fits this description. And as we were just observing, there is no doubt whatever that by the end of his life, Herod the Great was violent. He was turning on people. I didn't use the word paranoid because I like to avoid it, but in sort of the ordinary jargon right now, we would describe him, I think, as being paranoid. However, it's very important to bear in mind several factors. One of those factors is what Herod the Great was suspicious of. Against whom did he direct his violence? And the answer is, tragically, as I was just saying, his own household, that is his family especially, also members of the aristocracy who were opposed to him, and of course his explicit military enemies, the Parthians at the very top of the list, and also those from the Maccabean household who had joined the Parthians. The story of the Massacre of the Innocents is really not about that at all. Indeed, the whole point of the story, the Massacre of the Innocents, is that they are innocent, that they hadn't done anything. That's why it's such a touching depiction. The other factor to bear in mind is the motivation that's given for the action in the story of the Massacre of the Innocents is a fear of messianic expectation. Messianic expectation that would put a messianic pretender into competition for the understanding of who it is who should be leading the nation. Now, this, interestingly, was one factor that Herod the Great never really had to worry about. He was not concerned with messianic pretension because he had been named King of the Jews, that was his formal title, by the Romans, by Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus, and Antony before the Roman Senate. He was not King of the Jews because he had said, I am seeking religious endorsement for my position. It was a purely political and extremely powerful title. And no one was ever in a position to dispute that title with him. In order to be insecure in the face of messianic pretension, you have to wonder about your own position. Now, this exactly suited the position, not of Herod the Great, but rather of his son, whose name was Archelaus. Archelaus did use violence against innocent people without cause, and he was without question concerned about messianic pretenders because he faced a very large number of them. Looking at this story as being a reflection of what Herod's son, Archelaus, did, and not something that Herod the Great did, also corresponds to the best chronology that can be put together. The best chronology that can be put together places Herod the Great's death in the year 4 before the Common Era, when he was 70 years old. And if you run that chronology all the way through the sources available to us, beginning with Josephus, but also others, they correspond very well. Now, of course, a date of 4 BC does not correspond very well for the story of the Massacre of the Innocents, which in the depiction of Matthew occurs after the birth of Jesus. So how does Archelaus then fit into this picture? Something about his own position, I think, needs to be understood for us to understand how this story of the Massacre of the Innocents was generated. Herod the Great, towards the end of his life, as I mentioned, had killed, just before his death, one of his sons, and long before that, he had killed 2 others. And he was constantly changing his will. It was an extraordinary symptom of his instability by the end of his life. And by the way, again, I think more an indication of his tragic flaw than it is of tyranny as such. It is exactly the kind of thing one does out of fear. But the will that he finally settled on was that of Herod Archelaus being the person that should inherit the throne, and as a throne, to become king of Judea. That's what the will stated. However, because of the conditions at the end of Herod the Great's life, that will was subject to dispute. And so Archelaus had to go back to Rome in order to get the approval of the Emperor Augustus of this will. His own brother, Antipas, disputed the will, by the way, to some extent, because Herod himself had swapped the position of the brothers. His brother Antipas disputed the will which favored Archelaus, and Archelaus' own mother was involved in this, as well as the sister of Herod the Great, Salome. They're all in Rome, along with a contingent of Pharisees and even a group of Sadducees, all of whom disputed Archelaus' title truly to be king. While this was going on, and largely because this was going on, there was an enormous amount of unrest in Judea, some of it provoked by Archelaus himself, who tried to put down any kind of protest by violent means, including inside the temple. So, for example, just before his departure for Rome, he had actually ordered in his soldiers to force people who had come to Jerusalem for Passover to leave. He basically suspended the feast for them in that particular year. So that naturally caused an increase in religious resistance to what Herod Archelaus was doing. So Archelaus then creates the conditions that are going to increase messianic pretension, and they do so with great vehemence. I'll give you one example of this. There was a local shepherd figure who claimed an affinity with David, who was also a shepherd. He claimed to be the Messiah, and he acted against the Roman garrison in a town called Emmaus. In response to this, the Roman forces, under a general named Varus, completely destroyed Emmaus, razed it to the ground. Now, readers of the New Testament will remember the name Emmaus as a place to which two of Jesus' disciples were traveling after the crucifixion, when Jesus appeared to them risen from the dead. In other words, some of what Archelaus did has a residence within the New Testament. Probably the most interesting feature of that resonance is a story that Jesus himself tells. This is the version in the Gospel according to Luke of what's called in Matthew the parable of the talents. In Luke, it's referred to as the parable of the pounds because it's talking about someone who leaves literally pounds of precious metal with his servants when he goes away. In Luke's version, however, in chapter 19, he is going away for a specific purpose. Namely, he wants to have his kingdom confirmed. In other words, he is identified in Jesus' parable with Archelaus, the only person who ever went back to Rome to have his position confirmed in the way that the parable refers to. And of course, at the close of that same parable, when the king returns, he reacts viciously and destroys innocents. This is just what Archelaus did. And in fact, Archelaus, as part of his vengeance campaign, when he returned as a result of his backing by the Romans, actually founded a new town, which he named after himself. His name was Archelaus. He called the name of the city Archelaus. It is between Jericho and Jerusalem. Jesus is depicted in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, as walking between Jericho and Jerusalem when he told this parable. In other words, he's reflecting on the events that occurred at the very beginning of his lifetime. So we can see the marks of Archelaus depravity within the New Testament, and they align much better with the story of the massacre of the innocents than the tragic tyranny of Herod the Great. At the same time, Archelaus' action, rather than Herod the Great's, makes sense chronologically.
So are you saying that the Gospel of Matthew could be referring to Herod Archelaus without calling him Archelaus? It's just Herod.
Just Herod, because this would not be the only place where the New Testament, dealing with a member of the family, calls the person Herod, whether or not his name was Herod. That is, they're using the dynastic name of whoever it might be. Something very similar occurs in the Hebrew Bible, where you find references to Pharaoh as if Pharaoh were a specific figure. Of course, you have to go further than that historically and ask yourself, well, which Pharaoh are you talking about? Are you talking about Ramesses II? Are you talking about Merneptah? Who do you have in mind? So in the case of the New Testament, sometimes a Herod might be Herod the Great. Sometimes it might be Archelaus. Sometimes it might be Herod Antipas. Antipas was the governor of Galilee during the life of Jesus. There's also a Herod Agrippa the First and his son, Agrippa the Second. It can be confusing because they often, on their coins, append the name Herod to their own names because they're trying for some of the prestige of the family name. And also, we have to face the simple fact that none of the Gospels is actually written by a contemporary eyewitness of the events concerned. They're written at some distance in time and also in geography, and therefore there is a tendency to generalize and to refer to any member of the dynasty as being Herod.
Now, how would you look at Herod Agrippa the First? This guy that we're told a very strange story about his death, a very horrible death he supposedly suffered, and but he's also someone that claimed to be someone very special. Like he appeared to claim to be the Messiah or something like that. What do you make of this?
Herod Agrippa II is an extraordinary figure, even among the Herodians, which is an entire dynasty of people who were exceptional, surprising, and sometimes aberrant. Agrippa seems to have combined all of those tendencies and really, in some ways, to have brought them to his height. He came to power because he was extremely friendly with the Roman figure who we will know in history as the Emperor Caligula. And of course, Caligula is known rightly as a mad emperor.
Just to quickly ask, did you mean to say Herod Agrippa the First? Because you said Herod Agrippa the Second.
No, I mean this is Agrippa the First.
Okay.
Yeah, Agrippa the First is the friend of Caligula, and they were friends because they liked to eat and drink with one another, and therefore Agrippa had an extremely expensive lifestyle. Unfortunately, he didn't have the resources to support that lifestyle, and this put him in difficult circumstances for a great deal of his early maturity. But when Caligula came to the throne, all of that changed. And therefore, it was possible for Agrippa also to have what no Herodian since Herod the Great had had, and that was an appointment to kingship. And for this, he relied entirely on Caligula. And at the same time, he proved to be a popular figure within Judaism for two reasons. One is I referred to Caligula as widely and rightly being regarded as being mad. Part of his madness was his tendency to think of himself as a god. Now, I know that a reference is often made to the way in which Roman emperors refer to themselves as being, in Latin, divi filius, son of a god. And the veneration of the emperor in that role was widespread. But Caligula took it very seriously indeed. And as a result of that, he actually ordered that a statue of himself should be erected in the temple in Jerusalem, which of course would have been catastrophic had it actually occurred. The reason it did not occur was because of the courage of two figures. One was the Roman commander, Petronius, who did not wish to follow through on this action and found various means, despite risk to himself, in order to undermine the order. And the other was the direct appeal by Agrippa to Caligula, his friend, which resulted in Caligula rescinding the order, at least temporarily. And that temporary suspension was enough because then Caligula himself was assassinated by his own alleged protectors. Agrippa, obviously a figure well known in Rome, was also central in seeing to the accession of the next emperor, Claudius. And it was by that means that he made his way in order to become the king of Judea in a way that fulfilled the ambition of Herod the Great, his grandfather. Agrippa also had the extraordinary advantage that he was descended from one of the sons whom Herod the Great had killed. And that means from Mariamne. That means also from the Maccabean priesthood. The result of that was that Herod Agrippa, given that background and given also his intervention with Caligula to prevent a complete disaster, appears to have been very widely admired within the Judaism of his time. He also joined with Roman imperial policy under Claudius to begin a policy of not considering followers of Jesus as being Jews in the same sense that others were. And for this reason, it is to Agrippa that is attributed the decision to begin a persecution of Christians within Judea. That seems to be part of a policy of realpolitik, in which you want to support those forms of Judaism that you see as being consistent with the rule of the Roman Empire and suppress other forms of Judaism. All seem to be going extraordinarily well for Agrippa when he was struck very suddenly and terribly with an illness which is described as being the cause of a pain in his abdomen and even the appearance of maggots. Now, here, it's interesting to bear in mind that the symptoms of Herod the Great at the time that he died are rather similar to those of Agrippa at his death. That is, the abdominal pain, the bloating, the appearance of worms or maggots. This is consistent with the description of a condition known as Fournier's gangrene. It's a complaint of the circulatory system where the gangrene appears not because of any injury, but because of the failure of the system of circulation itself, which brings about the death of cells and therefore this gangrenous and dreadful condition. Herod Agrippa died at a much earlier age than Herod the Great, but of course he did not lead the extraordinarily active life that Herod the Great had. So the thought that this could be a genetic illness is one which I think is supported by the historical descriptions.
We have a super chat question.
Sure.
John Macker, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Chilton loved your book. Can you discuss the relationship between Philo of Alexandria and the Herod dynasty?
Certainly, yes. And thank you, John. I've enjoyed having contact with you. Yeah, Philo of Alexandria is a major figure in Alexandria. We know him primarily as a philosophical writer because he produced an entire work which is dedicated to commentary on the Torah, but commentary on the Torah which is in the aim of a particular argument, namely that you can really only understand the Torah if you understand also Plato, and you can only understand Plato if you understand the Torah. He sees these two things together. And for that reason, Philo, in addition to being a fascinating philosophical source, is also important culturally because what he shows us is that there's a form of Judaism which is not in the least embarrassed about the combination of Judaism with Hellenistic culture. In fact, they're seen as strengthening one another. Now, this is a point of view which obviously goes hand in hand with what the Herodians were doing, because the Herodians were serving the Romans at the same time that they were engaged with the defense of Judaism, sometimes heroically. Now, in the case of Philo of Alexandria's family, they turn out to have fascinating intersections with the Herodians, especially from the time of Agrippa, whom we have just been referring to. I spoke of the various financial problems that Agrippa had throughout his life. I actually suspect, had he remained as king, he still would have run into financial problems. I don't think that he ever outgrew those unfortunate economic habits that were part of his pattern from an early time. But on his way to Judea, when he was seeking to fulfill the appointment that had been given him, he stopped into Alexandria and arranged a loan. He arranged that loan from a relative of Philo of Alexandria. And at the same time, he arranged the marriage of his daughter, whose name was Berenike, to this wealthy businessman. That contract completed, he was able to go on his way. Now, that's not in any way the end of the relationship, because that family relationship between, I'll call it for the moment, the Agrippan branch of the Herodian dynasty and Philo's family goes further. The prominent businessman who was a relative of Philo died because he's quite aged. Berenike went on to marry subsequently. But another relative of Philo's wound up actually being named to govern Judea by the Romans, so that the Agrippan family winds up actually having a relationship with the Roman governor of the area of Judea. Something to bear in mind here, and it calls attention to the extraordinary prominence of Herod Agrippa I, is that after the time that Archelaus, who I mentioned, was deposed, and Archelaus was deposed because of his cruelty. I mean, there were delegations sent back to Rome protesting his behavior among Samaritans as well as Judeans. After Archelaus was removed from power, Augustus decided, following Herod the Great's will, Herod Antipas would be the governor of Galilee. Philip would be the governor of Golanitas, which is an area corresponding to the Golan Heights today and its surrounding territory. But Judea itself would not be governed by a Herodian. It would be directly governed by a prefect. And this administrative title of prefect, later, as it became necessary to beef up the military presence in Judea, came to be called procurator. But at first it was prefect. And for most of the time after the deposition of Archelaus in 6 of the Common Era, until the end of the first century, that role was fulfilled by a prefect or a procurator, except when it concerned Agrippa. That shows you the extraordinary extent of his influence. But that also meant that because the son of Agrippa, this is Agrippa II, and also the sister of the same Agrippa II, namely Berenike, having a marriage relationship to the Roman governor, having this dynastic succession behind them, having a relationship to the Maccabees, they also, even at the end of the first century and after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, they also cherished the ambition of both rule in Judea over all of Herod the Great's ancestral lands, and also, and at the same time, the elevation of Judaism within the Roman Empire. This is, in a way, a practical outworking of the philosophical program of Philo of Alexandria. So the relationship between the two families is, yes, incidental, highly political, but they also share a common program. And that program teaches us something about the practice of Judaism in the first century, which we probably would not have realized unless we looked at the way in which apparently philosophical literature, in fact, represents a very widespread cultural program that in turn tells us about the practice of a religion.
Well, thanks for that super chat, John Macker. I also want to say real quick, I also want to thank John Macker for setting up this interview. Let's get back to the PowerPoint presentation. So what do you think about Herod Agrippa II, and also in Acts when Paul appears before Herod Agrippa II? I noticed that in the New Testament, Paul, at least it seems that Paul has frequent contact with powerful figures. And even in his letters in Romans, he seems to be talking about something to do with Caesar's household. So what do you think is going on here at the trial? Why is he being put on trial? What's the deal?
Yeah, Paul's position in Jerusalem is extraordinarily tenuous at the end of his life. And that is because of Paul's own intent in going to Jerusalem. As is well known, Paul developed an entire theology according to which those who were born within Judaism were able to continue practicing their religion and at the same time to believe in Jesus as the anointed, the Christ. And included with them, there were to be non-Jews who needed to be accepted themselves as being a part of Israel. Now, it's that last feature, this idea that believing Gentiles become a part of Israel, that made Paul's theology so controversial in its own time, and I would say continue to make it controversial. I don't think that the full implications of Paul's thought are usually taken on board today. But in any case, in his own time, that resulted in extremely stiff opposition. And in order to push back against that, and also in order to represent and enact his own theology, Paul devised the plan, which you see reflected in several of his letters. And I think it's most relevant to speak of his letter to the Romans, because he wrote that just before he departed for Jerusalem, his last visit there. He developed the program of putting together a collection of donations from his various communities, from those individual churches, for offering what he refers to as being the sacrifice of the Gentiles in Jerusalem. What does he mean by that? He means that he will go as a practicing Jew, indeed, as someone who was ancestrally a Pharisee, and go to Jerusalem and on behalf of all believers, both Jewish and Gentile, make this offering. He goes to Jerusalem at a time when there has been an increasing degree of unrest. I already mentioned that for the most of the first century, the rule of Judea, and that includes Jerusalem, is by means of a prefect or a procurator. If it's procurator, that means there's more military power. And by the time that Paul returns to Jerusalem at this stage, Jerusalem with Judea is under a procurator because there has been an increased amount of violent activity. The reasons for that are that different factions in the city took to hiring street gangs who were known as the Sicarii, the people of the short daggers, who would use these to attack opponents. And catastrophically, the Romans themselves had tried to enlist these local thugs, as had members of the Pharisees and members of the Sadducees. And in addition to that, an increasing number, here we go again, you'll remember this from the time of Archelaus, an increasing number of Messianic pretenders. These break out from about the year 60, and they continue to mount over time until revolt breaks out against the Romans in the year 66, which is a disastrous year for Judaism, in that Rome then declares war against Jerusalem and the temple itself. So this is a situation that Paul is coming into. And when he does, the result is he enters into Jerusalem, and the rumor is locally that Paul is not simply making an offering on behalf of non-Jews. He's actually, the claim is, bringing Jews into the temple. An attempt is made to diffuse this rumor by an arrangement between Paul and the leader of Christian believers in Jerusalem at that time, who was James, the brother of Jesus. And James had been preparing some of his followers, obviously all of them Jews, he had been preparing some of his followers for what was called the Nazirite vow, a vow in which, after a period of fasting and discipline for purity, those who took part would enter into the temple as part of the offering of sacrifice. It is this group that Paul brings into the temple, but when he does, the rumor against him has been so strong that the claim goes round and about the temple he is introducing non-Jews into a place where they must not come. And in fact, the Roman authority itself actually set up signs that said there's a limit how far non-Jews can penetrate into this area. The claim goes up, Paul has broken this law. The consequence is a riot and also the arrest of Paul. When he's arrested, he's in a rather desperate position, and therefore he claims his right of Roman citizenship to a proper hearing. Why does he have that right? He has that right because he was born in the city of Tarsus. And the Jews of Tarsus had Roman citizenship. It's something about the nature of Judaism in the first century, and indeed before the first century, which is sometimes overlooked. Julius Caesar had a particularly friendly relationship with those who practiced Judaism because they were his early supporters. So when Julius Caesar was about to take over Tarsus, he was so welcomed that many of the Jews led a movement to rename the whole city Juliopolis in honor of the conquering Roman. Jews were offered the possibility of the free practice of their religion. They could collect monies for the temple. Now, yes, there was also local opposition to Jews, but Judaism was a legal and to a large extent a favored religion, and certainly consistent with citizenship, which Julius Caesar granted to the Jews of Tarsus. So Paul can use that right, and he claims it. He uses it very effectively. He still has to deal with enormous local opposition to him on the part of authorities in the temple. We should bear in mind that Jesus himself had been crucified because of this dispute in the temple. So to have another of his followers following along that line of opposition naturally aroused considerable concern. In the course of that, Paul makes an appeal directly to Rome, that is, to be heard in the capital, far away from the dispute itself. It is only after he's done that that Paul is described as appearing between Agrippa II and Berenike, along with the procurator, and they hear out his case. And interestingly, Agrippa II comes to the judgment, as reported in the book of Acts, that there would be no reason to send him on to Rome, except that Paul had actually made this appeal. Now, I think it should be said that there is a degree of apologetic argument within this scene. For example, Agrippa is described as saying to Paul, "Paul, if you continue speaking in a little while, you'll make me into a Christian." It would surprise me very much if Agrippa II actually used those form of words, although that is possible. There's a tendency within the books of the New Testament to portray believers in Christ generally as getting along with authorities better than they actually did. I mean, let's keep in mind that the only power capable of crucifixion, which is how Jesus died, was the Roman power. So that is a governmental execution and cannot be anything but that. Similarly, no one can send Paul to Rome except under Roman authority, which at this stage, Agrippa II and Berenike are clearly a part of. Having said that, I also have to agree with you that Paul shows a remarkable amount of sympathy to people who are in positions of governance. And this may have helped him in his appeal to Agrippa II and Berenike. The reason for that is, again, Tarsus, where Paul came from. Tarsus was a Jewish city. It had a sizable Jewish minority there, who, as I said, enjoyed citizenship. And in addition to that, Tarsus was a major center for the philosophy known as Stoicism. And Stoicism, contrary to its modern reputation as being a philosophy of not showing suffering, as if that would make up for anyone's actual philosophy, contrary to that reputation, is actually a philosophy with a passionate concern for the discovery in life of what the Stoics called in Greek the logos, the word. What is the underlying logic by which our lives are governed? And they saw this concept of word as being present in the natural environment and also in government. And Stoic philosophers over time, in fact, contributed to a conception that the Roman Empire itself should be ruled according to a natural logic and order. Paul looked favorably upon that. And in fact, if you consider Paul's writing and also the Gospel according to John, you'll see that there is a considerable sympathy for Stoicism within the New Testament. And there's yet another strand of this that I find very interesting indeed, and that is that it wasn't only Paul who showed a connection with the Herodian dynasty. Also, if we look back in the Gospel according to Luke, one of Jesus' disciples, one of his women disciples, is described as being married to a person named Chuza, who was a servant of the Herodian dynasty. So that moment in the text is quite stunning because it suggests that followers of Jesus could actually be aware of what was going on within the court of the dynasty. At this time, it's within the dynasty of Antipas, who, as I said earlier, was the governor of Galilee. And also that dynasty could be aware of what was going on within the movement of Jesus. Hints of this kind emerge within the New Testament. And what they show us, I think, very clearly is that the writers of the New Testament are well aware of the political environment that they are living within and how they might respond to it. And for that reason, as we read these sources, we need to be aware of what they are responding to. What kind of Herodian is in power at a given moment. For example, as I said, here in this story in Acts, Herod Agrippa II is showing sympathy towards Paul. Yet his father, Herod Agrippa I, as I explained, developed a policy of persecution of believers in Jesus. These different policies will naturally, over time, produce different attitudes towards government. And that helps explain why it is we find those differing attitudes within the New Testament itself. For example, Paul himself, writing to the Romans, tells us very clearly that believers should submit themselves to the authorities. This is part of his closing argument in his letter to the Romans. Yet, just after a few years after his arrest, after this appeal, when he writes to the Philippians, instead of speaking of submission to the authorities, he says, our real citizenship is in heaven, that is, not with Caesar. So that's perfectly understandable, given that his environment changed so significantly in the period of time that elapsed between those two letters.
We have another super chat question from Rex Profanus. Thank you for the super chat. Is there a notable, interesting information of the Herods and the imperial power structures between 70 to 96 AD? Sorry if asked prior or if this was covered.
Well, it was covered, but only implicitly. So I thank you for the question. It's a pertinent one. What I just said in regard to Agrippa II and Berenike takes us to the point where the war with Rome is about to occur. That is, as I said, there's an increasingly amount of violence in Jerusalem. There is mounting use of military force by the Romans, increased violence by the Sicarii and other forces countervailing them. And ultimately, what occurs is a disastrous decision, I would say, is made within the partisans known as the Sadducees. That is the high priestly interests in Jerusalem. They decide in the year 66 to take a fateful decision. And that decision is, it's interesting actually in terms of what we were just saying about Paul. That decision is that from that moment on, no offering from the hands of a Gentile would be accepted for sacrifice within the temple. The reason that apparently purely religious decision is so fateful is that until that time, there had been an arrangement according to which the emperor would take part in the arrangement of sacrifices in the temple twice a day. It doesn't mean the emperor is there. It doesn't mean that a Gentile can enter into the sanctuary. Everyone understands that. That's part of the legal operation of the temple endorsed by Rome. But there would be an offering provided from the emperor, which means as it's offered, the temple is a focus of prayer for the emperor, not to him, but for him. In a way, a method was found to let Judaism take part in the recognition of the emperors that I referred to earlier on. So if you say no offering from this moment will be accepted, you're saying we are now independent from Rome. And Rome understood this. This is what triggered the decision of the Senate to send in the 10th Legion Fretensius under the direction of the Roman Emperor Vespasian, and the result was crushing. Now, that is a large picture, but within that whole time, the two Herodians before whom Paul presented himself, Agrippa II and Berenike, were involved on the ground. And they're involved on the ground because of the temple. They do not have authority from Rome in Jerusalem itself, because remember, that's actually governed by procurators by this time. But because of the Herodian connection with the temple, they can worship in the temple. And I think the most heroic figure in the effort to stop what happened from actually occurring was Berenike, the sister of Agrippa II. I referred earlier to the Nazirite vow and the fact that when Paul actually wanted to get into the temple, he arranged to accompany people who had made this vow. That's because the Nazirite vow was accepted as a way in which a person showed devotion to the temple. It required discipline, it required fasting, an act of purification, and sacrifice. Berenike went to Jerusalem as violence was mounting, took part herself in a Nazirite vow. And as part of that vow, what one did, because one had kept purity for the period of the vow itself, what one did at the close of the vow, while offering sacrifice, was also to shave off one's hair entirely and to present that hair as part of the offering. It's a unique procedure within Judaism, set out from the time of the Hebrew Bible. It's a very public act of devotion. Berenike performed the act, and then she went to the Roman procurator, who was in Jerusalem at the time, in order to appeal to him that the violence should come to an end. That failed. It did not eventuate. And as a result, ultimately, as I said, in the year 66, the decision was made, no more offerings from Rome, and therefore war broke out between Rome and those in the Temple of Judea. It had to be the Romans who won, and they did win, although the fighting was extraordinarily bloody and resulted in devastation, not only to Jerusalem, but well up in Galilee and throughout the land. The Roman policy of razing cities and enslavement and killing was brutal and remorseless. When it was quite clear that war was unavoidable and it was going on, both Berenike and her brother, Agrippa II, were explicitly on the side of the Romans, supported them thoroughly. Agrippa II himself offered aid in the form of military assistance. Berenike began an affair with the commander of the Roman forces, Vespasian. This results in the most extraordinary final act of the Herodian dynasty, because that same Vespasian ultimately became emperor. And as part of his machinations to become emperor, in fact, Berenike was quite important. Remember that question we had about the relationship between the Herodians and Philo of Alexandria's family. That connection was used by Berenike to find support for Vespasian to become emperor, which he did. The result of that was that his son, Titus, with whom now she was having a well-developed affair, was in charge of the eventual victory over Jerusalem, and therefore also the burning of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Question is, however, would it ever be possible for the temple to be rebuilt? Could there be a rededication? After all, the Babylonians had once destroyed the temple in the year 586, before the Common Era. Yet that temple was rebuilt and became the basis of the temple that existed in the first century. There was no reason to believe that the destruction of the temple was definitive when it first occurred. And in fact, a contemporary of the events, Josephus, speaks of the possibility of a restoration of worship there. This appears to have been the dedicated purpose of Berenike, as well as in her passion for Titus. Titus will eventually become emperor himself. And his relationship with Berenike became a matter of public scandal because marriages with foreigners was not a part of the ethos of Rome. Once upon a time, it had been outlawed, in fact. And there were those who reported that when they went to Rome, when cases were adjudicated, instead of the emperor, there was Berenike, who was, in effect, behaving as if she were an empress. So for that reason, the question emerged whether Titus would follow his passion and marry Berenike, whether this might be possible. We'll never know whether he would have, because despite the fact that he was extraordinarily vigorous as a person and a fine ruler, he died prematurely, simply, it seems, from some form of a respiratory infection akin to the flu. So that the final ambition of the Herodian dynasty, which might again have been achieved by Berenike, as it had been achieved by her father, Agrippa I, was robbed at the very end. It's an extraordinary coda to their remorseless search for power during the course of the entire first century.
What do you think caused the downfall of the Herodian dynasty?
In the end, I think that by that stage, by the time that Titus died, the relationship between Berenike and Titus had been the only viable path forward for a continuation of the dynasty in power. Now, that is not to say that it didn't continue. It did. However, it becomes more difficult to trace after Berenike because it's much less prominent. You're dealing now with local client rulers. And Rome itself established itself as the power on the ground in Judea. And then, of course, any possible revival early in the second century was ruled out of question by the second revolt against Rome, which broke out in 132. After that revolt, which resulted in another 3-year war, Roman policy in Judea was much more strictly to establish a wide system of urban developments and roads, and also no longer to have recourse to local rulers, as had been the case during the time of the Herodians. So basically, Rome's change of policy meant that finally the Herodian dynasty was eclipsed.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Bruce Chilton.
It's been my pleasure.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.